Yo, what's going on, everybody? This is Nothing But Bangers, aka MBB, aka Bangers, aka we got a surprise trailer that has included 9 EX Pokemon and a couple of supporters, both very intriguing. We're going to talk about those new cards right now in this video. Let's get to it. The new set is called Shining Revelry. It is supposed to be a mini set, but unlike some of the other mini sets that we have seen, it has actually a lot of EX Pokemon compared to the other ones, and it's, I think, supposed to be slightly larger in terms of overall set size. The first card that we'll talk about is the Charizard EX, which is a stage 2, so no basic EX Pokemon that are evolved, right? So no Charizard EX, that's a basic, but we are, which is probably a good thing, by the way, but we are seeing a different Charizard. For 1 energy, you can attack. It's got to be a fire energy, and you can take 3 fire energies from your energy zone and attach it to this Pokemon. So it ramps itself. You won't need Moltres. However, you will need to be able to attack at least 2 times, right? One with Stoke, and then the second attack would be with, that Steam Artillery attack, which is 5 energies. 2 of them are colorless for 150 damage, and there's no discard, so it's just a base 150. That's it. So this card doesn't lose as hard to Mew EX, for example, but it's still not favorable into a Mew EX in the sense that if you have a Charizard in the active and then they have a Mew EX in the active, unless you're ready to attack with Steam Artillery immediately, you're going to have to take 1 turn to ramp, and then they're going to have a turn where they can hit you for 150. But on the bright side, if they, assuming that things work out the way they're supposed to, your Charizard EX would be able to KO their Mew EX on that following turn. So there's a little bit of an upside to this Charizard when you talk about that scenario. And so you wonder, is there a world where you play, one of these Charizard EXs and then one of the genetic Apex Charizards? I don't know. But again, there's definitely some side grade comparisons when you compare the 2 Charizards, but again, not doing 200 damage is a little bit of a minus, right? Because 150 is going to be able to take care of a lot of Pokemon, but there's going to be these niche scenarios where 150 is just not enough, and also 5 energies to attack is pretty expensive. So I'm not ready to write off this Charizard EX completely, but just initially looking at it, this begs the question, is rare candy going to be a thing, right? Because if you could rare candy this, on turn 3 of the game, so you go first, Charmander pass, they do whatever, then on turn 3 of the game, you rare candy to Charizard and then ramp with Stoke. That's definitely pretty good, right? And you could see a scenario where, if that's the case, well then yeah, you would probably rather play this Charizard rather than the genetic Apex Charizard. So again, we'll have to wait and see what the rest of the set has, but there's definitely a little bit of a question of okay, how good is this Charizard EX with the help of the other cards in the set that maybe we haven't seen. Lucario EX is a stage 1 fighting type. That is also a little interesting because it's a stage 1 EX that has a 3 energy attack. So you're not going to be able to attack with this on curve, right? So say you go second, you open up Riolu, you put an energy on it, you attack for 20, you pass back to your opponent. That's turn 3 of the game. They do whatever. Well, on turn 4 of the game, when it comes back to you, if you evolve, you won't be able to attack. So there's a little bit of an awkward pause with this stage 1, and that leaves me wondering just how good this card really is. But if you look at it more as a alternative to something like a stage 2, so for example, instead of playing a stage 2 fighting deck with Gallade or with Rampardos, your finisher is Lucario EX, right? So maybe there's a world where instead of playing Rampardos, instead of playing Gallade, you actually play 2 Lucarios and then 2 Lucario EXs. And, you just basically look at the game state and you build your deck, normally with the Hitmonlees, the Marshadows, the Sudowoodos, whatever technology you want to add for that fighting type. But then you kind of have that mid to late game option to either go more damage with the base Lucario, right? Or do you want to go with the finisher Lucario EX? And so, just looking for situations where these cards, do something in their best case scenario, as opposed to just kind of looking at the cards on their own and trying to evaluate them. Because I think you have to try to put this card in its best case scenario, and all of these cards in their best case scenario, to really get an idea of like, can this be very powerful, right? Because again, like, looking at this card, it's got clear problems. And so again, I think that there could be some potential to playing, a 2 Lucario and then a 2 Lucario EX line. So you're basically playing that traditional like 2-4 stage 1 lineup. That could definitely be a thing. But again, I just wonder, like, is it worth it, right? Can it actually take the place of those stage 2s that you see in those traditional fighting decks right now with Gallade and Rampardos? Tinkaton is also is also an EX Pokemon, but it's a stage 2 EX. So that's one thing that for people that may not be familiar with this Pokemon, probably should immediately try to recognize is that it is a stage 2. If this was a stage 1, it'd be a little bit different. But as a stage 2, it's a little interesting because it's almost it's 3 energy attack, and if you flip a coin and it's heads, it's going to deal 80 more damage. So it's going to do 80 plus 80 more. So on the low end, this is going to deal 80. On the high end, it's going to deal 160, which 160 is a good break point. But you look at this as a stage 2, and it doesn't really like break any mechanics of the game. It doesn't necessarily have like incredible like stats, and it's not like it's necessarily hitting for like the biggest damage in the game. So if you take a look at like most stage 2s that are playable, this does not check a lot of the boxes. And so like immediately kind of like looking at this card, I would say that this card is pretty weak. But hey, there's potential that the stage 1 is really good. Maybe the stage 1 is very good, and that makes this card playable. But just initially looking at this stage 2 on its own, like it's just, there's a lot of other cards that are just better that I would rather play in the steel type. So, just kind of looking at this card, unless the stage 1 is really good, like say it's like a Magneton, like I think that it's very hard to see this card getting a lot of play at the top levels of Pokemon Pocket. And, again, hey, I'm always open to being wrong. That's happened several times in these videos as well. So this is the regular looking Charizard EX. So we've seen the shiny Charizard, and then now we are seeing the regular Charizard. So again, nothing too crazy. It's still the same card, so don't get freaked out. It's still the same card. So Giratina EX is a basic psychic Pokemon that is EX Pokemon. It has 150 HP, and it has the ability Broken Space Bellow. Once during your turn, you may take a psychic energy from your energy zone and attach it to this Pokemon. If you use this ability, your turn ends. So you won't be able to turn 1, use the ability, and then use something like Dawn, so that way you can attack first turn. That's the first thing that, you got to make sure that you're aware of, because this card could potentially have some cool synergy with a card like Dawn. But, with the fact that your turn ends, it does kind of cut off some of that potential. When you look at the rest of the card, it's a 4 energy attack for 130, and it's going to recoil for 20 damage. So it kind of reminds me a little bit of Arcanine EX from Genetic Apex. However, it is a basic Pokemon, and its attack is 1 energy more expensive. So there is that. The other thing to kind of look at is this is going to have 2 retreat costs, so cards like Leaf are probably going to be beneficial to playing Giratina EX. So it's something to look at as well when you're trying to build around this card. It's very tough to like really get to the point where you can say, hey, yeah, this card is solid. Although you can ramp going first, which is like really unique in its own way. But again, like you're still not able to attack with this card until, your third turn of the game, right? So if you go first, you ramp it, your turn ends. Turn 3, you attach another energy and ramp it. Okay, it's only got 3 energy, right? So you're not going to be able to attack until turn 5 of the game with Giratina. So there's a lot of things that you kind of have to take into consideration when playing with Giratina EX. And you kind of have to think like, well, what Pokemon can really, get away with not having an attack, right? Because if those first 2 turns of the game, you're never attacking, well, then like what Pokemon are you playing alongside Giratina EX that can benefit off of not attacking? Is it a card like Druddigon, right? Is it a card that's like a like a wall, where basically it's got to take damage, but it walls your opponent from getting to your Giratina? And so like that's kind of the first things that I think of when I take a look at this card. And again, if you're gonna play Druddigon and Giratina EX and Leaf, right? That all has good synergy because, Leaf does cover this retreat cost. You just wonder, like, is 130 really enough to really impact the game, right? And so, yeah, again, you just kind of have to look at this card and think, okay, well, the best synergies are probably cards that I don't need to attack with, that are in my active, and this is on my bench. And from there, you can kind of try to build around and kind of cook with it. But, like, just off a first glance, I would say that this card is, it's probably... I would say it's a little weak, but again, I want to see what the rest of the set has and like, what other cards we can cook with. This Pikachu EX is a little interesting because it does deal 150. The biggest problem is, it's 120 HP, so it's a little squishy, which, that's been the case with the other Pikachu EX as well. And then you look at the fact that for 150, it's going to discard all the energy on this Pokemon. So not even like all the electric type, it's just all the energy, right? So, you can't really like load energy on it and then like, slowly discard. It's just like all at once, boom, it's gone. This Pokemon is fascinating because, as a finisher, it definitely has that like that Raichu feel, right? Where it's dealing 150 is like a finisher, but it's discarding all the energy. But like you just got to wonder like, hey, what times are those scenarios going to happen, right? Like when am I going to be able to suddenly have 3 energy on my Pikachu EX to use as a finisher? Because with Raichu, you had Lieutenant Surge. But right now, there's not really a card that enables that for this Pikachu EX. And so there's a lot of questions as to like how to make this card good. And like I think in the best case scenario, it's your finisher and you're basically, loading it up throughout the span of a game because maybe you're using a Pokemon that ramps energy like the new Pachirisu that we'll talk about here in a second. So again, maybe there's a little synergy there. Right, you have your manual attached per turn, but then you get your ramp from your attacking Pokemon. Maybe there's a little bit of synergy there, but again, like just initially looking at this, I would say it's probably a little weak to see play, and probably a little too squishy, right? So, but again, hey, who knows? It could work as a finisher in some of these electric decks that maybe try to pop up with the new Pachirisu that we'll talk about towards the next part of this video. Wugtrio EX is a stage 1 EX Pokemon. It's got 140 HP for 3 water energies. One of your opponent's Pokemon is chosen at random 3 times. For each time a Pokemon was chosen, do 50 damage to it. So it's going to remind you a little bit of like Dragonite in a way, but it's a little bit different, right? Because it's going to deal, it's going to choose 3 times and deal 50 damage. So it could choose one Pokemon 3 times. It could choose, 3 different Pokemon 1 time, right? But again, like it's spread damage, and it could potentially, deal 100 damage to a Pokemon that only has 40 damage on it. So like that's a little bit of an issue, I would imagine. The retreat cost is 1, and then that electric weakness is obviously notable. But again, like this is a really unique attack. We haven't really seen too many Pokemon have attacks like this in the game, and so you wonder like, is there something there? Best case scenario, hopefully you're able to get multiple attacks off with this Pokemon. And there is a question of like, how the math would work with cards like this and like maybe a red, right? Like, like, hey, red is a supporter, which we'll talk about here in a second, but like theoretically, red should deal 70 damage if your opponent's active Pokemon is an EX and you hit it with Wugtrio. Then you start thinking, well, hey, like, the best case scenario is that it deals 170 because it just goes all to the active EX Pokemon. So, At max damage, this is dealing 170, maybe 190 if the defending Pokemon is an active fire type that's weak to water, so there's potential there. But again, it's just hard to see this card being good in a lot of other scenarios, and so I would probably lean towards Wugtrio EX as being one of the weaker cards that we've seen revealed so far out of these EX Pokemon. Again, this is a look at the non-shiny version of Lucario EX. So again, same card, just different art, and obviously not shiny. But again, Lucario EX is definitely an interesting Pokemon to keep an eye on. The Paldean Clodsire EX is a really interesting Pokemon. It's an EX, right? So it's going to have that drawback of if it gets knocked out, your opponent gets 2 points. But it's a stage 1 that can attack for 2 energy. So it's a stage 1 with 160 HP, so decent stats. And if your opponent's active Pokemon is poison, this is going to deal 60 more damage when you use Venoshock. So 60 damage plus a potential of 60 more. Then, so you're looking at 120 damage potentially. And then if you play a card like Red, it could deal 140 damage. And then if the Pokemon is poisoned, it's going to take 10 in between turns to maybe get it to 150 damage. If it's weak to dark types, you're looking at 170 damage overall. So there's a lot of different things there. And again, with Red, there's obviously another 20 points of damage that could be added. So when you do all of the math with this, this is best case scenario hitting for 120, right, because it's poisoned. 10 for the damage uptick, which is going to push it to 130, and then if there's weakness and Red, that's an additional 40 damage, so that's 170 damage. So 2 energy for 170, best case scenario is what you're looking at. And again, that's obviously super best case scenario. The downside of this is it's going to deal 60 damage, right? You're going to have a way to consistently poison your opponent's active Pokemon, which is a lot of the time going to be done with something like a Weezing. There's also that Toxicroak technology, but Toxicroak is also a stage 1, and then you have to find a way to retreat it, right, after paying the energy to attack with it. So, it's very conditional. But if we do get a trainer card or a Pokemon ability that can poison, maybe it's from poisoning from the bench, or maybe it's an item card or a supporter that poisons the active Pokemon, Clodsire could definitely be very interesting. And so I look at it as like a Scolipede that's not as terrible, but again, the downside is you do lose the potential to play a 1 prize deck. And so that's one of the big pluses, if there's any plus side to something like a Scolipede. I do wonder how this is going to look when it comes out, but again, a lot of this is just going to depend on what other cards we get in the set. And so right now I would say it has potential, but as is, if you look at it right now with what we know so far, I would say it's probably not that good. It's probably just average, right? I'm not ready to say it's as bad as something like a Tinkaton EX seems to appear, and maybe similar to how Giratina EX is really conditional, but again, I'm not ready to call this the worst EX of all time or anything like that. I just want to see what else we have to go alongside it. But again, pretty interesting, may have some potential. Beedrill has been an interesting card since it made its appearance in Genetic Apex as being kind of like an aggro alternative, but again, being a stage 2 has kind of always held it back. When you look at this card, it's going to be a stage 2 EX, and that's the first thing that's a really big negative, right? If you're going to be a stage 2, especially if you're going to be a stage 2 EX, you need to be really, really good. And looking at this card, 170 HP, that's decent. The fire weakness could hurt a little bit, just depending on how the meta shapes up. Right now I would say that's probably okay. You can probably get away with that. But the 2 energy attack for 80 damage, that's pretty decent. And then when you read the effect of this attack, it says discard a random energy from your opponent's active Pokemon. So best case scenario, you're slowing your opponent down from being able to maybe attack, right? Whenever you hit with Beedrill. The downside is you discard a random energy and then they just attach an energy and KO you, right? That's the worst case scenario. So There's a little bit of a downside with the attack, you know, in terms of like maybe the discard doesn't really do anything to your opponent. But the alternative, like hitting an energy that really matters, like, hey, that could really slow your opponent down a turn and then enable you to 2-hit KO something with Beedrill EX. The fact that it's 80 damage is a little bit on the low side. However, if you're able to deal damage throughout the span of the evolution, or maybe you're able to acquire damage in other ways with like Rocky Helmet or stuff like that, you know, there's a potential that the 80 damage could really pile up, especially in a 2-hit KO. The 1 retreat cost is also decent. You know, you just look at this card and you wonder like, hey, is it too slow and like not impactful enough? And like, that's probably the verdict. But if we do get cards like a Rare Candy, you do wonder like, hey, does Rare Candy open up the ability for cards like this to see play? Because maybe I use Rare Candy on this, and then all of a sudden I'm disrupting my opponent, slowing them down a turn to like ramp, or slowing them down enough to where like they can't really get started, and I'm just able to start KOing before they can like really play the game. So really interesting. Again, we just have to wait and see what the rest of the set is. But like right now, I would say it's a decent card, but probably not good enough for a stage 2 with the cards that we know right now. But again, with something like a Rare Candy, which again does allow you to skip that stage 1 if it's, you know, if Rare Candy does, you know, what it traditionally has done in the past, then, you know, maybe Beedrill EX could see some play. I saved the best for last, okay? Obviously, I'm, you know, being biased. But Bibarel EX is 160 Stage 1 Pokemon. Not very good, right? Like, you look at that, you're like, oh, man, 4 energies to attack. That's probably not very good. And, you know, in all reality, this card is probably not very good. But let me try to sell you on this card and look at the upside. So the upside of this card is that you use something like a Manaphy to turbocharge your Bidoof. Maybe you attach an energy, you know, the next turn onto your Bidoof and maybe evolve to Bibarel, and now you're 1 energy away from having a Carefree Press, which is hitting for 100 and healing you for 30. The reason why I bring up Manaphy is that does allow you to play water energies and Arita. So Arita, Manaphy, Bibarel, I could see that, you know, obviously being a meme deck, I don't think it'd be necessarily good enough to, you know, really compete with the top tier decks, you know. But hey, in a perfect world, maybe you're able to sneak in an attack with Bidoof and have their you know, HP on one of their powerful EXs, you know, and then next turn attach an energy and evolve to Bibarel and tank a hit, and then next turn hit them for 100 and heal 30. Maybe use Arita and heal for an additional 40, right? So there's, you know, best case scenario. However, how often will that happen? You know, that's probably not very often. And so, you know, there's a lot of like ifs and what ifs to make this card good. And even when it's, you know, online and dealing 100 and healing for 30 and maybe 40 more with Arita, you wonder, like, is that really enough to like sweep an Arceus Dialga deck, right? And the answer is like, you know, probably not. But hey, maybe healing for 70 is enough to push it over, you know, some thresholds. You know, if you heal for 70, right? So let's just say that you take 130 from an Arceus, right? So you're down to 30 HP. Healing for 70 is not really going to be enough to like change the damage breakpoints. And you know, if you know you were able to have their Arceus with Bidoof and then attack next turn somehow with Bibarel EX, you know, maybe that's a favorable scenario. But again, like, you would need something like a Dawn or like some form, or you would need to have like 3 energy on the Bidoof before, and then it would need to survive Arceus. So like, it's just like probably not going to be very good. But again, I'm sure there will be some memes with it, and I will definitely partake in those memes. This is the Pachirisu that I was referencing earlier when talking about Pikachu EX. This Pokemon is going to be a basic Pokemon with 70 HP, so it will be able to survive some hits from those fighting Pokemon that are basics. Obviously, like forgetting the fact that, you know, Lucario could be a card, but that's the first thing that I think of when I see Pachirisu. I'm like, oh man, dude, can it take hits? Like, because there is fighting decks around. But when you take a look at this card, it's going to deal 10 with its plasma attack, and if it has an electric energy, right, it's going to deal 10, and then you're going to be able to take one electric energy from your energy zone and attach it to one of your benched electric Pokemon. So this is the ramp that the electric type is going to be receiving. The problems again are just fighting is, it's a very present type in the current metagame. And the fact that Pachirisu is going to need stuff like Giant Cape to really survive more than one turn in a lot of scenarios, if it's staring down fighting types, is like a big problem. On the flip side, if you're not staring down a fighting type and you're staring down something like a Manaphy, well, Pachirisu can really punish those Manaphys without, cards like Giant Cape existing. So there is potential for Pachirisu to make damage on other ramp cards, even like staring down a Moltres EX. Pachirisu can do some pretty good damage to it in the active, although Moltres EX is like kind of falling off of a cliff. The other cards that you think about this going heads up against, into a Dialga, at least you could chip the Dialga, but Pachirisu lining up into a Druddigon does feel like it could be pretty bad. So there's, obviously that. But again, electric types getting a little bit of a ramp card is kind of cool, and you wonder like, hey, what does this enable? Does this enable some Electivire decks, right? Does this enable some Luxray decks? What about those, decks that have been playing cards like Lieutenant Surge, those electric decks that are trying to play cards like Volkner? Does this Pachirisu card make those decks any better? And like, what's the best case scenario with Pachirisu? Is it legitimately ramping cards like Pikachu EX from Genetic Apex and then allowing them to do 90 very quickly while having a damage spun in the active? Or does this open the door to cards like Zapdos EX, coming back from Genetic Apex and potentially being able to attack a turn faster, right? I mean, there's a world where, hey, you open Pachirisu in your active, you go second, you attach an energy, Plasma attached to your Zapdos EX. Next turn, you X speed out of your active, you attach your Zapdos, EX energy per turn, and then you use Dawn to move the energy from Pachirisu to the Zapdos EX, and you are swinging for a potential of 200 damage very early. So, like, that's probably, like, some of the best case scenarios, right? But again, like, that's still a coin flip attack on a Zapdos EX, and you're still needing multiple combo pieces to really enable that. But again, like, that is pretty significant, right? Like, is Pachirisu a card that can bring Pikachu EX from Genetic Apex back from the dead? I think that's a valid question. But again, there's just so many fighting types. You wonder, like, is the fighting type weakness going to be able to be overcome? So really cool card. I think it does enable some new decks and some decks that may have been dead to maybe come back now. But let's talk about Wiglett. Wiglett is the basic Pokemon that Wugtrio EX evolves from, and 60 HP for 1 energy. It's going to deal 30 damage to a random Pokemon on your opponent's side of the field. So kind of an interesting attack. 1 energy for 30 damage is pretty decent, but again, you just never know where the damage is going to hit, right? Unless there's only one Pokemon on your opponent's side, then you know for sure where it's going to hit. So we'll see if that ends up mattering. It is worth noting, I don't know, the interaction between this and Druddigon might be fascinating, right? Like, if Druddigon is in the active and Wiglett hits Druddigon, do you still take the 20 damage as a recoil? I don't know. I actually don't know on that. I'm going to have to just like wait and see. Maybe somebody in the comments knows, theoretically. Varoom is a card that can evolve. So maybe, the stage 1 of Varoom ends up being pretty good, but, as is, just another card that, is being printed to the Steel type that, hey, just, hopefully it has a good stage 1. Tatsugiri, I misread this card immediately, and I was like, oh, your active Pokemon has no retreat cost. Like, that's crazy. Shaman just got power creeped. And then I actually proceeded to read the card correctly, and I noticed that, hey, it says your active Dondozo has no retreat cost. So this is like a combo card, right? Think of it like how Arceus is a combo card. But basically, if this card is on your bench and you have Dondozo, in your active, or Dondozo. How do you pronounce that? In your active, your Dondozo has no retreat cost. We have no idea what Dondozo does, so that'll be an interesting card to see revealed. And hey, maybe it's some good synergy, but right now it's just kind of a card that we have not enough information about. Spigatito. There we go. That sounds good. Spigatito is a basic Pokemon that does evolve into a stage 2 eventually. It's a starter Pokemon. So there is potential that the attack actually does kind of matter, right? Cry for Help allows you to put one random grass type Pokemon from your deck into your hand. So that gives you a +1 in card advantage and potentially a card that you can send back with Pokemon communications. So if the stage 2 is good, Spigatito is a decent card to open up with, right? Because you don't mind opening up Spigatito, getting an attack in, and getting that extra card to your hand, thinning your deck a little bit, and having a little bit of decent synergy with Pokemon communications, because a lot of stage 2 playing decks are also including Pokemon communications. So there's a little bit of synergy there that maybe could be interesting. You do wonder, like, hey, if you are, like, let's just say that you miss getting the stage 2 with your Cry for Help, maybe it allows you to find your stage 1 and you can immediately evolve it your next turn. So there's a little bit of an upside to Spigatito. It could be an interesting card. I would definitely keep an eye on what the rest of the evolution line looks like, because hey, we have seen a stage 2 starter that has been pretty impactful if you go back to Superior from a while ago. So again, there's precedence for a stage 2 non-EX to be pretty good, and who knows, maybe they give Spigatito an EX stage 2 that it can evolve into. Although hey, we've seen 9 EXs so far. Not sure how many more we'll see in the rest of this set. The last card is actually fascinating from the Pokemon point of view. I have a couple of supporters that I want to talk about as well, but Pinsir and Barry, it now seems a lot better. The attack is 50 damage, and then you flip a coin until you get tails. It's going to deal 40 for each heads. So it could potentially deal 90 damage for 1 energy, which is pretty decent. The downside is that, it's potentially 50 damage for 3 energy, right? Like, that could definitely very well happen in a game where, hey, maybe you ran out of berries and you've had time to attach, grass energies to this, and like that could be really bad. This could be another alternative from Snorlax with Berry, but I think that right now I would probably still rather play Snorlax Berry Magnezone rather than Pinsir Berry Magnezone. So just my initial thoughts. But again, it is cool that Berry does get another card that I think works better than the Pinsir that we have right now. And so like that kind of like gives you a thumbs up. But again, you just wonder, like, what other grass type Pokemon can I play alongside Pinsir and Berry? Or is, the best build strictly Magnezone, Pinsir, Berry, right? But again, like, only hitting for 50 damage guaranteed is a little bit of a downside, because like you could use your Berry and only deal 50 compared to, playing Snorlax using your Berry and dealing 100. Right. So, hey, it is a turn faster, so maybe that matters a lot. But again, it's a little worrisome. It is a little nerve-wracking to maybe stare down like a turn 2 Pinsir with Berry. Like, let's just say that you open, whatever starting Pokemon you open with, with less than 90 HP, right? And then all of a sudden your opponent opens Pinsir Berry, and you're like, oh, wow, I'm a heads away from being KO'd and donked. So it does open up that potential, and hey, maybe there's some potential with it there, but initially right now I would say probably not better than Snorlax, Magnezone, and Berry, but hey, I'm open to cooking with this card and seeing just how much value you can get out of that early aggression with a card like Pinsir. I think Iono is one of the most interesting cards that we've seen revealed so far. Each player shuffles the cards in their hand into their deck, then draws that many cards. So basically it's a supporter that allows you to reshuffle your hand, right? The immediate downside is that obviously it takes up your supporter for turn. And then the other downside is that it is a inherent -1. So you're now playing with 1 less card and kind of hoping that the new hand you draw is, noticeably better to now prepare you to win the game, right? The other upside is that potentially you Iono the card that your opponent needed in your opponent's hand back into their deck, and then they don't draw it, right? So like there is a little bit of like potential disruption, but like it's probably going to happen not that often. And then on the flip side, you're hoping that your new set of cards helps you progress your game state. So where does this card shine? In my opinion, this card shines in decks that can generate card advantage. So somehow they're generating cards to your hand, or it helps you find your evolutions a lot faster, right? So in decks that are trying to evolve very quickly or evolve on curve, I think that this card can definitely help potentially make those decks better, right? So let's just say that you're playing cards like Chateau along with Iono. Well, hey, maybe you're copying your opponent's hand size, at the end of your turn 2, and then you draw cards, right? Your opponent passes it back to you on turn 4, and then you evolve and then play Iono to now get more cards in hand to maybe place on your Pokemon, place on your bench, or maybe, now you decide to Iono and then follow up with another Chateau attack where you shuffle your hand and copy your opponent's hand size. So like there's a little bit of cool synergy with like Iono and Chateau, or Chatot, as some of the commenters would like to say, because they're not as, fancy as me. But again, like I do think that Iono has potential to see play, and I don't think that it's a bad card, even though it does have some pretty big negatives. I think that there are going to be some decks that prefer to play Iono and would almost classify Iono as a staple, right? But I do want to see how this card plays, and I do want to try it with stage 2 decks, with fossil decks. I do want to try it to play around with this card, and then hey, I do want to see what synergy you could have with cards like a Chateau. I think that's very interesting, and I'm definitely interested in cooking with Iono. The other supporter card is red. So red and blue, obviously, if you know anything about Pokemon, they're kind of like right opposites, right? They're supposed to be like rivals, right? In a sense, right? But they're like opposites. So blue reduces damage and red increases damage to your opponent's active Pokemon EX. So when you use this supporter, attacks used by your Pokemon are going to do 20 more damage to your opponent's active EX Pokemon. The immediate way that this card stands out is in one prize decks that are trying to find other EX decks, right? So for example, if you're playing like a one prize fighting deck, right? Red might be a card that you really like, and it may do the job that Lucario does. However, if your opponent is not playing EX Pokemon, well, red becomes significantly like a dead card, right? So in the one prize mirror match, red is 100% worse than a card like a Lucario. On the flip side, right? On the flip side, by playing Lucario, you have, 4 spots that you have to give up in your deck to play Lucario, compared to the 2 spots, or maybe even 1 spot with red. So there's a little bit of a give and take with red when you talk about it in the context of fighting decks. But if there were ever other one prize decks that were other types, like let's say that you had a water one prize deck, right? Red could potentially slide in very well. When you talk about 18 trainer decks, red could definitely take a spot in some of those decks as well. You can make the argument, hey, is red just a straight up upgrade in 18 trainer card decks? Because again, if you're playing 18 trainer card decks, you could potentially say that, hey, I already beat, all the basic one prize decks or one prize decks as is. So adding red is going to help me against, those other matchups. That's definitely a possibility. But again, like a card like a Sudowoodo, if you're staring down a Sudowoodo in an 18 trainer deck and then you play and you have like a red in your hand, like it's going to feel pretty bad, right? Because red is not going to do anything. So again, there's going to be some decks that really like red, but I don't know that we're ever going to see red really be good as a 2 of, just because if there's a good one prize deck, that makes red a lot worse, right? Like right now, there's a good one prize deck with Rampardos and Lucario. So you can't really sell red as a viable 2 of, right? As a 1 of, for sure, right? You could get away with it, but playing it as a 2 of, it would really suck to have like just multiple dead cards against a fighting deck, right? So like I feel like that's probably the biggest weakness, but I do think red definitely has potential and some different decks, specifically those 1 prize decks that want to really target EX decks, right? So really interesting set so far. I'm looking forward to seeing what other cards they reveal. I am very curious to see if Rare Candy becomes a card that they introduce. And I know a lot of people have been kind of like split on as to like whether that would be a good thing. With Charizard EX from Shining Revelry, I do get a little nervous about potential of a Rare Candy. And even with a card like Beedrill EX, I get a little nervous about the introduction of a card like Rare Candy. So we'll have to wait and see what the rest of the set brings. Overall, I think it's really cool that they snuck up on us with this mini set. A lot of people did not see this coming. I would say most people didn't see this coming. And this is going to coincide with the addition of ranked mode. There was a little bit of an announcement about ranked mode and like Master Ball being the top ranking. It looks like it's going to be 1 month for a season potentially. We have no word on leaderboards, which to me needs to be a thing. I hope that they find a way to do leaderboards, but they may not have it ready yet. And, you know, hey, the other big elephant in the room is if a new set's coming out, does that mean we'll be able to trade Triumphant Light? And that has been the case, right? When a new set comes out, we are able to usually trade the previous set. So my previous video where I talked about some decks to get you prepared for ranked mode, it might get a lot easier to build some of those decks if you're able to trade Triumphant Light. And now would be a good time to start saving hourglasses as well as you prepare for the new set and the new ranked mode. There's a lot of stuff going on in Pokemon Pocket, and I have another video coming out very shortly about a team battle style that has been really interesting, really fascinating to follow. I'm going to be casting the finals of that team battle as well. So I want to talk to you more about that and the structure of that, and maybe sell you on the potential of a team battle that could be a new way of playing Pokemon Pocket. So look for that video coming out very soon, and I will be casting that final on Sunday, which should be the 23rd of March. So very soon, I'll talk to you more about that in that video. But again, as always, thank you for taking time out of your day for me to be background noise. Maybe it's entertaining, or hey, maybe you learned something. I appreciate you tuning in, and I hope you hit that follow button or that subscribe button on the bottom right of the video. And until next time, I'll catch you later. Peace.